Okay, so I'm back. In the previous video, we saw how to create this shader network here, which is a little bit more complex and advanced than what we started off with. And we're using an ambient occlusion. We're compositing the dirt map on top of a color map. We're using bump mapping, and we're doing some math operations over here to get this custom shader looking pretty nice the way that we want it to. Okay, now let me go ahead and let me close the render view window. And in the viewport, I'm going to select that rock, which you can kind of see right there. There it is. And I'm going to go ahead and click on this button here, which is the graph materials on selected objects, the little blue icon here with the two green squares. Okay, and here is the shading graph for the rock. Doesn't look too great. What we need to do is add the ambient occlusion effect to this. So to be able to do that, we're going to have to go ahead and reconstruct some of the stuff that we previously did, which actually isn't going to be too hard. Now, we don't have a cavity map for this, so we don't have to worry about compositing that stuff on here. So let's go ahead and quickly recreate those nodes that we need over here. We're going to need a surface shader and another surface shader. We're also going to need to go to mental ray nodes and create ourselves an ambient occlusion node here. So I'm just using the middle mouse button to click and drag that stuff over here. I'll go back to create my nodes, and I'm going to create that multiply divide node from earlier, which is this one. So middle mouse button, drag and click that there. Let's hide the create toolbar there, and let's go ahead and get started on this. So I'm going to take this surface shader here because I already know that I have to call this the rock material shader. So I'll just right click, go to rename, and I'll call this rock underscore matte. I'm going to take the Lambert 2 shading group here, rename that one as well. I know I have to call that rock underscore matte, and then put SG at the end for shading group just to keep things nice and organized. And I know that I have to open up the attribute editor for that rock shading group, and I'm going to go ahead and middle mouse button click and drag the rock material on top of that and plug that right into the surface material slot there. Okay, so this one goes there. And I also know that I have to take this Lambert shader, which takes the color map and the bump map and plugs it into the first input of the multiply divide node. So let me open up the multiply divide node by double clicking on it, and I'm going to take a middle mouse button, drag the Lambert 2 and drop it on top of input 1. And again, we get that connection editor from the previous video, and what I want to do is go down to the out color, which is right here. So I'll click on it once, and now I'll click once on input 1. They'll become italicized. I'll close that window, and then of course we can see we have that connection there, that little green arrow and the line going down to the multiply divide node. And move this stuff out of the way, get this position about right there. And this surface shader has to have the ambient occlusion plugged into it, so I'll open up the surface shader 3 input, or attribute editor I should say. Middle mouse button, click and drag the ambient occlusion node and plug it into the out color here. So it's pretty simple. It's just going through the same process as before. And what I'm going to do is open up the multiply divide attribute editor and middle mouse button click and drag the surface shader 3 to the input 2 right there. And again, when this connection editor window opens up, we'll just take the out color, plug it into the input number 2. Close that window, and there we go. It's all plugged in, ready to go. Now all I have to do is open up the attribute editor for the rock material here, which is that surface shader. Middle mouse button click and drag the multiply divide node and drop that into the out color right there, and I'll go ahead and finalize that connection. Let's just click on Rearranged Graph up here. Again, that's the icon of the 3 little gray squares on the top and 3 little gray or yellow squares on the bottom. Hit A on the keyboard to frame all on this stuff, and there we go. There's our ambient occlusion being plugged into our shader node there, surface shader. That's being multiplied by the results of the Lambert shader. And that's going through this other surface shader, which in turn goes to the rock material shading group. Okay, so let's close that attribute editor, minimize the hypershade, and let's go ahead and render this out again, see what we got. Okay, excellent. So we can see that the rock is darker now than it was before. If we go to a previous render, the rock doesn't have any darkness associated to it. Now it does. Now it's a little bit too dark, as you can see. I don't like that too much. So to fix that, if you remember, we have to go to the ambient occlusion node in the hypershade, open up its attribute editor, and go to the max distance, and let's set that to 5 because we used 5 for the ground, and that actually looked pretty good. So let's just do render region of that area right there to see if it looks any better, which it should. And there we go. That looks a whole lot better than before, as you can see. You can see it's still pretty dark, but it's not a very exaggerated effect. The effect isn't too much to handle. Okay, perfect. So let me go ahead and close the render view window. We're not going to use it for the moment. And I'll go to my viewport here. And what I'm going to do is switch to wireframe view by hitting 4 on the keyboard. And basically, I have to give that rock material to all the other rocks in my scene. So it's pretty easy. I'll just go in here and start selecting all these little rocks and pebbles and things like that. There's not that many, so there we go. I've got them all. Now all I have to do is go into the hypershade, and I'm going to go to the rock material here. I'm going to hold down the right mouse button on top of it, and then I'm going to go up here to this option that says Assign Surface Shader to Selection. So I'll go ahead and do that, and once I do that, these rocks should have the material applied. And just to confirm, I'll go to any one of these rocks randomly. So I'll go to, say, this one here, zoom in a little bit, and I'll render that out. Okay, and there it is. There's the rock texture now on all the little rocks. So that looks pretty good. Let me close that. Okay, so now that all the rocks have the correct material, it's just a process of coming in here and finishing this off. We only need a couple of more materials for these wooden posts, and of course for that tin can. So let's go ahead and do the tin can right here, because that's going to be a little bit interesting. And I think I may have missed one rock. I don't know if I missed this one here. Let me select that rock and hit Control A to open up the attribute editor. And we can see that yes, it does have the rock material here in the attribute editor, which means that it's good to go. Okay, so let's go back to this tin can over here. And with the tin can selected, what I'm going to do is apply material to this. But instead of going in here and, right clicking on it and going to assign new material and creating a brand new network like this in the hypershade, which is going to be a huge waste of time, one thing that we can do is simply, because that can is going to use a similar shader network to one of these, so what we can do is copy one of the ones that we already have to do a lot of the work for us. So that's what I'm going to do. What I'm going to do is go to the click on this button here on the right with the little black rectangle on the top, so I can go back to my materials over here, and I'm going to go to shading groups category, and over here we have our ground. I'm just going to hit A to sort of make these icons larger, and right here we have this ground matte SG. That's why it was very important to rename these so you can know what's what. So I'm going to select the ground matte SG shading group, and what I'm going to do is simply go up to edit, and I'm going to go to duplicate. I'm going to go to shading network because I want to duplicate the entire shading network. So I'll click on that, and that creates this second ground matte SG1. It has number 1 at the end, so I know it's the duplicate. Okay, so what I'm going to do is very quickly, with the attribute editor open, I'm going to rename this. I'm going to call it tin can underscore matte SG. Okay, there we go. So let me close that. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take this material here. I'm just going to right click on top of that node, and I'm going to click here on graph network. That's going to give me the whole graph down here. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and go back to my work area view down here, simply by clicking on this second icon here with the little black rectangle at the bottom. And here we go. Here's the tin can, and it duplicated the entire network. So all this stuff you see here is duplicates, basically, of the network that we had before, which still has the ground textures and stuff like that, by the way, which isn't going to work out. So we need to basically switch the textures out for the tin can textures. We need to make some adjustments, possibly to the bump map, not sure yet. And the ambient occlusion is already there, so we don't even have to worry about setting up the ambient occlusion and the multiply and divide node because that's already set up. What I am going to do is rename the ground matte 1 material over here. I'm just going to call that tin can underscore matte. There we go. So now it's just a matter of coming in here and just plugging in the different texture maps for this. So for the color, I'm going to double click on that, go here to the folder icon, and I'm going to load up the tin can color, which I have here. Here's tin can color. Go load that up. There it is. And I'm also going to go to the cavity map here. Open that up, and I have a tin can cav map right here. So I'll open that one up. I'll go to the bump map and do the same. I'm going to load up the tin can bump. There we go. Okay, all the filter settings are perfectly fine. Everything's good to go. The only thing that you'll notice is that the texture repeats a lot. That's because we're using a ground texture duplicate. So I'll just open up all of these place 2D texture nodes and reset the repeat U and V values back to 1 and 1 for all of these. Can't have that repeating a whole bunch of times like that, or else it's not going to look right. Let me go over here to the bump node, and I want to increase the bump. I'm going to increase it to about 0.5 because 0.02 is not going to look good for the tin can. The ambient occlusion set to a max distance of 5. I think I'm going to leave it at that. Not totally sure yet. I'll leave it and see what happens. If I don't like it, I'll just change it and re-render. Okay, I don't have to make any changes to anything else. But there is one thing I want to do. This shading network is going to be a little bit different than the shading network for the ground material, simply because I want to give this some shininess. Because this is a tin can, and even though it's rusted and old, it should still have some properties of shininess to it, a sort of dirty reflectivity to it. So what I'm going to do is I need to go over here to this result shader here, which is actually Lambert. If you see here, it says type Lambert, and a Lambert shader doesn't give me any type of specularity or reflection, anything like that. Okay, so what I need to do is go to the type drop down box and switch to a blend shader. So when I switch to a blend shader, the only thing that changes is the fact that it's a blend shader, but the color map stays intact, the bump mapping stays intact, and I'm happy with that. So the blend shader is a bit shiny. Okay, so let me do this. Let me minimize that hypershade. I'm going to close the I'm going to take the reflectivity and turn that, or I'll leave it on. Doesn't really matter. I'll close that attribute editor, and I'm going to do a render of the tin can. And this is what I end up with. Big mistake. I forgot to do the simplest thing, which is to assign that new shader to the tin can. So that's going to be pretty easy. All I have to do is select the can, right click on top of it, go down to assign existing material, just find that tin can material, which it's right here, and there we go. Let's go back to the render view here, do a quick render region. Okay, so there's a couple of things here that I don't like. The reflectivity I don't like, and the shininess I don't like. It's too uniform across the whole tin can. And another thing that I don't like is that inside the tin can we can actually see stuff which we probably shouldn't be able to. And that was the whole point of ambient occlusion. So I'm going to save this image out so we can compare against it in a moment. I'm going to go back to the hypershade. I'm going to go to the ambient occlusion node, and I'm going to take that max distance and set that to 0. That way the max distance goes on forever, which is going to look a lot better. Also, what I want to do is go to the blend shader here, and I want to apply something called a specular map. And the specular map is going to help to regulate and break up the specularity of the object, which adds a nice touch of realism and more detail to the object. And I don't want this object to be reflective because it's not a mirror or a piece of glass. So I'm going to take this reflectivity here and knock it all the way down to 0. And for the specular color, actually let me do that again. Editor, edit that. Video starting again. 3, 2, 1. So what I'm going to do is take this reflectivity, knock it all the way down to 0 because, again, it's not a piece of glass or a mirror, so it doesn't need reflectivity. And for the specular color, I can't leave it at just a simple dull gray. I'm going to click on the checkerboard icon here, and I'm going to plug in a file. So I'll go to File, and again, it didn't open that that attribute editor automatically, which can happen sometimes with Maya. So I'll just go here and click on the input for the specular color. And for the texture repeats, I'll leave alone at 1. But I'll go to the file node, and I'm going to click on the folder icon and load up the tin can specular, which you can see here. Okay, so I'll open that up. And I'll open up the view button here so I can show you what it looks like. This is the specular map for the tin can, as you can see. Again, just like with a bump map or just like with a cavity map, it's a grayscale image. Okay, the darker the color, the closer it is to black, the less reflectivity and specularity, less shininess you're going to have in those areas. So these areas where it's really dark and black, there's going to be virtually no specularity. no shininess. And the areas that have some mid-grays are going to have about medium shininess. Any areas that would be pure white would have complete shininess to them, which in this case you don't see that. What this does, it breaks up the shader so that the shininess looks a little bit dirtier and grimier and more realistic. Okay, so let me close that. And let me hit the Rearranged Graph button over here in the Hypershade, just so this all gets organized again. Okay, so here's the specular map over here. It's called File 3, which is no good. So let me go to Rename. I'm going to call it Specular. Okay, there we go. So now that's what's controlling the specularity of the blend. Now, you notice that it has a default quadratic filter, which I don't like. So I'm going to switch it probably to... I'm probably going to turn it off, actually. Let me turn it off because that's probably going to look a little bit more interesting if I leave it off. And let me close that attribute editor. And now with that done, let me go back to the render view. Here's the before image, which I saved out. And now let's do render region and see the difference. There we go. Now that looks a lot more interesting. As you can see, it looks dirtier and grimier, and the specularity is broken up, so it looks a lot more realistic. So here's the before, where it looks almost like if it's glowing. It doesn't look very realistic at all, and there's just this uniform specularity all over the object. And right here, we've broken up the shininess. So some areas, like these areas where there's a lot of rust, have no shininess whatsoever. Because on a real piece of rusted metal, if you take the time to look at one, you notice that a slab of rusted metal, wherever it has rust, those areas really aren't going to be shiny, if at all. And the areas that are still clean, still have that polished look, the rust hasn't corrupted those areas yet, are still going to have some shininess to it. It's going to be dirty, but it's going to have a little bit of shininess to it, which is the case here. As you can see, especially here where the light's hitting the side here, you can see in these gray areas we have a little bit of specularity, and in these rusted areas, even where the sunlight is hitting it directly, we can see that there's virtually no specularity, if at all. And that can really make the difference in your work from looking amateur or looking pro. So it's very important to understand how those kinds of maps like specular maps, cavity maps, and all that stuff comes into play. And now, since I increased the amount of ambient occlusion, now we can't see directly inside the can like we could before. Here's the before, here's the after. Now it looks dark in there, and it looks more appropriate the way it should be. Okay, perfect. So let me close that. I'll go back to the Hypershade. So this is what our shader graph here looks like for our tin can. Okay. Now what we need to do is create a shader network for the wooden posts. But you know what? This video has gone on for a good while. What I'm going to do is end this video here, and in the next video we're just going to wrap this up and do the wooden post material, which is just some old dirty wood, and then we'll wrap this chapter up. Okay, so I'll see you in the next video.